Hi again. This is Dan Alasso with History for Today, and this is the third part in probably 5 on my series of videos that I'm making describing my takeaways and my reactions to Sönke Ahrens' book, How to Take Smart Notes. And in this one, I want to deal with chapters 7, 8, and 9. Now, chapter 7 is called Nobody Ever Starts from Scratch. And what I take this to mean is that both there's always been a lot of pre-work done before you sit down at a blank screen or an empty sheet of paper, and also that nothing is really completely original. We learn from others, and it's a bit artificial to draw distinct boundaries between our ideas and somebody else's. Of course, in academia, we have conventions and understandings about intellectual property and plagiarism, and in general, I think that these are soundly formulated. But we should take a moment every now and again to remember that we are community creatures and that our worlds are culturally constructed. I heard a story recently, I think it was in an interview that Nathan Merville did on a podcast, where he said that the credit that physicists get for being groundbreaking theorists has a lot to do with coming along when there's a lot happening. He doesn't quite say that it was easy to get a new quantum mechanical effect or principle named after you when the field was brand new, but the implication is that the new paradigm provides a lot of opportunities for the first people on the scene to win by elaborating on these new discoveries. Ahrens says that by focusing on what interests us and keeping a Zettelkasten type of record, we will discover clusters of ideas that gravitate toward topics and provide blocks of information with which we can build a structure around a topic. I like the point that the brain isn't particularly objective, consistent, or a reliable tool for coming up with essays. This is pretty obvious. And it's why we don't compose essays, arguments, novels, etc. solely in our heads. But it's probably worth repeating, especially the next time you're in a seminar or a meeting where they give you a whiteboard or a giant post-it note and a set of markers and ask you to brainstorm. Although I suppose the theory behind that might be that interaction is going to produce something greater than the sum of the parts, and I do think that that's valid. I don't disagree with Ahrens' argument that students are not being particularly well served when they're told to, in his words, squeeze a non-linear process like writing into linear order. But on the other hand, I feel like this argument is almost becoming a bit of a straw man. Yes, it's unsurprising that students feel stressed when they're asked to write on something that they haven't had the opportunity to study and read and take notes on for months or years. But let's be realistic. In any given semester, they are going to be confronted with new topics and information that they've probably never considered before. At least, hopefully they will. And then they will be asked to respond to this new information in writing. This process, therefore, is something that students should learn as early as possible in their careers, and then practice from day one and practice daily in class. And so I'm working on designing my courses to help make this happen. In the next chapter, chapter 8, Ahrens talks about creating positive feedback loops. And I agree that these are valuable in providing both motivation to learn and in the learning process itself. I also agree that the standard model of academic writing, definitely graduate, but probably undergraduate term papers as well, has way too few opportunities for feedback and for interactions that will help the students refine both their writing skills and also their thinking about a topic. All too often, the only time that they have interaction with their instructor or professor on their term paper or their research paper is at the end when they're presenting a finished product. And the assumption here, I suppose, is that they've been taught to do this before, but I don't think that we can assume that in most cases. I think the observation that expressing ideas in writing gives the students the opportunity to self-assess and to affirm that they've understood an idea is valid and is helpful, especially in the absence of frequent instructor validation. Peer interaction can also be useful here, I think, to take the pressure off the teacher and to have more feedback without the instructor having to touch each and every comment that the student makes in order to make it real. I also like the idea that learning happens best and quickest and easiest when we embed new information in what Ahrens calls the lattice work of mental models. I suspect that the isolated factoid is like a prehistoric hominid cut off from the tribe, very unlikely to survive and to reproduce. And I think this is borne out in the things that Ahrens mentions about the slip box, and that goes back to things that Niklas Luhmann himself said about isolated ideas in the slip box that sort of wither and die or disappear or are never seen again. The 9th chapter is the beginning of kind of the practice section of the book, and I'll cover the rest of this section in the next 2 videos. But this one is kind of about tasks. Multitasking, Ahrens says, makes us feel more productive. But studies have found that this feeling is actually inaccurate. We're actually fooling ourselves, and we do best when we focus on a single task at a time. Ahrens also cites the mere exposure effect, which causes us to mistake familiarity with expertise. And this train of thought, which echoes some of the things that I've been reading in Daniel Kahneman's book and other places, makes me wonder how much of the time we're actually getting by on bluffs. In any case, organizing workflow seems to be important in this section. I've recently been watching some videos about interstitial journaling, which is apparently useful for some people to help smooth the transitions between tasks by getting us to actually put one thing down and stop thinking about it so that we can move on to the next thing. Ahrens has said earlier that we have trouble dropping things out of our short-term memory if they seem unresolved, and that even acknowledging an unresolved issue can trick our minds into putting it down and moving on. I think Ahrens is kind of channeling David Allen here because I think this is also a big element of getting things done. Outlining is a process that requires us to sort of step back from the individual blocks of thought to see how they can be arranged and stitched together into an argument. Seems like some of the elements of this quilt that we're stitching together will be data, and other parts could be propositions or arguments. Maybe it makes sense as I'm developing my permanent notes, which I'm also in the process of talking about this week, to distinguish between the two. I assume that there is a life for important data as a permanent note, but I suppose that it's possible that these are really like more permanent reading notes, and that the real permanent notes, or maybe I should start calling them evergreen notes, might be primarily assertions that are then supported by these collections of evidence. I have to think about this and about how I want them to be available to me in my vault. There's a quote that's attributed to President Dwight D. Eisenhower that comes from his days as a general that Ahrens says he heard a long time ago in the Army. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. I actually found this in the Eisenhower papers, which are available online. Ahrens goes on to talk about expertise, which he calls embodied experience. This is the thing that happens after the 10,000 hours, I suppose, when the response becomes automatic and you can do a thing without thinking about it. He tells an interesting story about teachers who are not experts themselves, and he says that these types of teachers prefer rule-following students to the flexible adaptability of experts who no longer need to read the manual and go through the process step by step in the way that the teachers are trying to get them to do it. And this is an interesting train of thought and an interesting anecdote. I'm not entirely sure that I get how it relates, unless that Ahrens is claiming that this type of expertise that these teachers are objecting to is uniquely achievable through some type of Zettel network effect. This is certainly plausible, but I don't think it's proven here that the Zettel is uniquely advantageous as a tool to build this type of expertise. So I'm not sure that I want to pursue this too much farther. In his next section, Ahrens says that, like attention, short-term memory is also limited. And this makes me think that I should structure my teaching on class note-taking and reading note-taking with this in mind to help teach them this skill. I also think that retrieval practice adds to the stickiness of these memories, but that's a different topic. Ahrens' point, I think, is that the external memory system of the slipbox is a way to push stuff out of short-term memory and to clear this logjam. The things that we understand and remember, he says, are connected to other things. There's a very compelling visual analogy with networks of neurons. Ahrens suggests that it's the process of connecting ideas as we add them that probably gives the slipbox its power. Since Daniel Kahneman and others have suggested that the way we typically connect these facts together is by way of narrative, it is kind of interesting that the slipbox is maybe an alternative to narrative and maybe works well in situations where a narrative would be too limiting or would be misleading. So according to Ahrens, in order to add a new note in the slipbox, we're forcing ourselves to connect it to a note that's already in the box. And I will think about this because I haven't yet actually required myself to do this when I've added a note to my Obsidian vault. That would be the equivalent of making sure that there was a double bracketed transclusion that connects it to something that's already in the vault. And that wouldn't be hard to do, and I do it in many cases, but I don't do it as a rule yet. So I'll think about that. In any case, I agree that as we add ideas, we should be asking ourselves questions like, how does this fact fit into my idea of whatever? Questions of context, of complementarity, or of conflict between ideas, reiteration or modification of other ideas that we've already processed, implications of the new idea to other items in the box. These are all very important and very interesting topics. Ahrens says that what he's doing here is breaking down the big and amorphous task of writing into a bunch of much smaller, discrete subtasks so that we can complete them each in a reasonable time and check them off our list. And this again sort of fits in with that getting things done idea, that you can't do a project, but you can do tasks in a project. He also advises documenting these task completions both to celebrate them for motivation and also to get them out of our short-term memory. And like getting things done, Ahrens believes that once you begin to trust these second brain systems to reliably keep track of this material, our task lists, our information, our arguments even, then we can begin to relax. Ahrens talks about ego depletion, which is a sort of psychic muscle fatigue that we can avoid by offloading a bunch of these routine decisions to scaffolding systems. A reliable and a standardized workflow or work environment is much less tasking on our attention and leaves more energy to actually do the task. And I think that's an important thought for me right now because since the semester has ended, I've been sort of struggling to do a bunch of things. When I came back from my little vacation trip, I had to race to get the garden sorted so that I could get plants in time for them to grow enough to be useful to me this summer. I've also been trying to keep up with making videos, and I've had several university-related projects that I'm trying to chip away at. So better organization will probably be very useful to me in picking up one of these things, working on it for an hour or two, putting it down, going to the next thing, and feeling good about what I've done at the end of the day. And maybe I'll make a video about that soon. But in the meantime, that is all I have for now on Ahrens. I will make 2 more videos about the final section of his book, which is the practice section, which will encompass chapters 10 through 14. So I hope people have found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you again